The heist is on. It's Tom here, and today I'm looking at Payday 2 on Switch, the first truly portable version of this game. Based on the Crime Wave edition released for PS4 and Xbox One 3 years ago, this packs in all its DLC and even adds a new wireless 4-player option with nearby Switch owners. But fundamentally, it takes the Diesel 2.0 engine of the last game and gives you the same gameplay experience as is from the other consoles. Bearing in mind PS4 and Xbox One run this comfortably at a native 1080p and 30fps though, the question is, what does Switch manage to pull off at a technical level? Okay, the game's just come out, and if you haven't played it already, I'm afraid I've got some bad news. On just about every level, Payday 2's optimization for Switch is a disappointment, next to Sony and Microsoft's latest consoles. Whether that's in terms of resolution, visual settings, or worst of all, the ability to hold 30fps, Nintendo's hybrid console doesn't hold up. Given this game has origins on PS3 and Xbox 360, I went into this hoping for a well-rounded port. I mean, we have Skyrim already running beautifully on Switch, for example. Ultimately, there's a lot that stands out as wanting, especially next to the current gen machines I'm comparing it to today. To start, Switch runs at a native 1600 by 900 resolution while docked. That in itself is a pretty good showing, and roughly what you'd expect relative to the PS4 version's 1080p. At 900p it looks decent while connected to a HD TV, and there's a strong post-process anti-aliasing to clear up any lingering edges. It's undeniably softer next to the direct competition, but it's a concession in pixel count I'd hoped would lead to parity in other areas, like the frame rate. Meanwhile, Switch's handheld mode drops to a native 1280 by 720 as you'd expect, a 720p image that fits cleanly with the Switch's display. The real problems start with Switch's visual settings. Running at a lesser 900p is fine on its own, but even in docked mode, quality of almost every setting is either dropped or disabled outright. Let's start with texture quality and filtering. Now, as a recap, the base Xbox One version uses a high quality 16 times anisotropic filtering compared to the trilinear approach used on PS4. It's a problem a number of PS4 games had around launch, causing textures to blur over up close to the camera, even if they happen to be high quality assets. On Xbox One that's no problem at all, and you can see textures are presented beautifully. Sadly, Switch inherits that low texture filtering quality of the PS4 version, a trilinear approach that muddies the floor. In direct comparison with Xbox One, there's really no contest. The other disappointment here is the textures themselves run at a significantly cut resolution on Switch. You go from sharp looking materials on walls and floors with Xbox One to these last gen quality assets. For the portable experience, these hold up just fine on Switch's smaller screen, but we're talking about docked full screen playback here. These textures fall very short of what I'd hoped for, and there's a lot more besides that. Shadows also show a clear cut in quality. Again, the filtering cascade is exactly the same as a PS4, but up close, the quality preset is simply lower on Switch. It's another cost-saving measure that really directs attention to the GPU power of Nintendo's machine, but it's far less noticeable than the texture issue. A bit of a disappointment, but these hold up well enough to not notice while in the heat of the action. Considering the shadow setting is also usually one of the more demanding areas when tweaking the PC version, it's understandable this would take a hit on Switch. Overall object draw distances are still very close to what we get on PS4 and Xbox One though. The geometric layout of banks, jewelry stores and nightclubs is perceptibly identical on Switch, and likewise for NPC counts, meaning scenarios play out in much the same way. And while there are a few anomalies here and there in draw distance, the framework of the game is very much intact. These locations are often complex sprawls, starting at streets filled with cars to shopping malls filled with nicely detailed shops, each partitioned by breakable glass. In its defense, this is a successful design choice for the Switch version. It does at least translate the core logic of the other releases at least, even if it does dial down the visuals over the top. Actually, there's one cutback on Switch that could rank as a bonus. Looking at the shopping mall stage as an example, the chromatic aberration effect is removed. This post-processing extra is fixed on PS4 and Xbox One, distorting the edges of the screen, but completely disabled on Switch. It was never a huge distraction, but for my money it does make this version look a lot cleaner around the edges. Call it a matter of preference, but the removal of chromatic aberration is another mark of the developer cutting back any visual features it can in a bid to save on performance. Sadly, that also goes for another nice post effect, light bloom. In this underpass stage, for example, perhaps the most demanding level I've come across, there's no bloom whatsoever on Switch. Check out the fluorescent lights overhead, and PS4 gets a clear visual advantage here. Outside of some minor shading differences between them though, the Switch release does have a lot in common with the other versions, even down to the limitations those releases had. One aspect that really sticks out is the use of a lower frame rate on characters past a certain range. The shopping mall stage shows this off best. Towards the corners of the screen, you can see characters animate at a jarring 15 FPS, even while docked. Worse still, they can often pop in from the sky or even glitch out on their first step forward. It doesn't look great. All taken together, Payday 2's visuals aren't really a showcase for the system at all. It may be one of few shooters available on the Switch, but there's already better looking examples of the genre, like the excellent Doom port. This is all compounded by the fact that, despite so many visual cutbacks, the frame rate just isn't up to snuff on Switch. Even with full GPU clock speeds accessible while docked, you can expect many drops below that target 30 FPS. The upside is, while the docked full screen experience isn't a looker, the rule of thumb is most cutbacks on Switch are perfectly acceptable if you see them in the handheld mode. That smaller 6-inch screen hides a lot of shortcomings, and that's certainly true here. In fact, comparing dock to portable, there are no differences whatsoever in settings, besides the resolution drop from 900p to 720p. Whether that's draw distance, texture or shadow quality, you get the same deal either way on Switch. Unfortunately, no matter how you play it on Switch, frame rates are a big issue. As an example, here's the game running docked, and while yes, that 30 FPS target holds out for a good stretch of play on some levels, there are others which slip down to 20 FPS and stay there for long stretches. The biggest culprits for this are geometry or character heavy areas with lots of destructible glass. The high levels of alpha transparencies play a big part, but it's also just the density of detail packed into one spot that makes this mall area drop so aggressively, and also an underpass stage later on. Now this has some of the signs of a double buffer VSync, with frame rates almost flatlining at 20 frames per second in the worst case. There's plenty of fluctuating between 20 and 30 FPS though, as the engine decides which to target. Worse still, Payday 2's drops stick out like a sore thumb for one simple reason. The gameplay speed is directly tied to the frame rate. So for example, if the game drops to 20 FPS, all the action suddenly plays out at 66% speed, making it feel almost like moving through treacle until it settles back at 30 again. Given how often the frame rate is shifting like this, that makes even simple acts like aiming needlessly difficult. And as I've mentioned, this all still happens despite the game stripping away so many visual features and targeting 900p in docked mode. All that sacrifice and what we're left with still feels unoptimized. To compound the problem, the game stutters the moment a grenade is thrown, a physics-based interaction that adds a sudden hiccup on top of any ongoing frame rate drops. Also, you may notice the occasional frame time spike to 16.7 milliseconds at points where the game does run at 30 FPS. It's a small frame pacing issue, but again, on top of the streaming stutters you'll encounter here and there, even in the best case scenario, Payday 2 doesn't feel particularly smooth on Switch. Next to the PS4 and Xbox One versions, this isn't what we had in mind. Here's a flashback to show you how those two perform in that demanding underpass area. A locked 30 FPS, nothing glamorous, but certainly no drops, and both push much higher grade textures and shadows at 1080p. Going back to Switch, and these drops are enough to distract even undiscerning players. I'll also say the state of the portable game is worse overall than docked play, and despite dropping the pixel count to 720p, many areas which previously ran at 30 FPS will now run closer to 20 FPS. My takeaway is this: last gen or not, Payday 2 is a demanding shooter with a lot of dynamics in place. It's hard to expect a perfectly fluid 30 FPS all the time, but for it to broach an acceptable level of quality, it needs to be much tighter than it is now. What's also clear is, the best optimized Switch games so far, whether that's Mario Odyssey, Zelda, or third-party efforts like Skyrim or Doom, all use a dynamic resolution to soften the blow on the frame rate. Each of these games understands that multiple effects, enemies, and taxing environments can combine to hit the frame rate, a sudden spike in GPU load, and so they allow for different adjustable resolution targets to work around it. In Payday 2's case, the numbers are entirely fixed, even in the most demanding areas, and arguably adding a dynamic resolution there could help prevent it running into a GPU bottleneck. What we've got instead are results veering much closer to 20 FPS, and unlike so many of its shortcomings, it's one that playing on a small screen doesn't hide well in this case. Overall, Payday 2 is a great concept, but the execution is much better on PS4 if you're looking for the couch experience. Otherwise, if you're after the best shooter on a portable system, you're maybe best served looking at something like Doom instead, unless a patch comes in to solve this game's performance issues. Anyway, that's enough from me. If you did find this video useful in any way, please do give us a like or even subscribe to get updates once a new video lands. Otherwise, to see this analysis at source file quality, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. But until next time, thanks for watching.